The thing on the trail. I've hiked the Appalachian Trail dozens of times, but what happened last October still makes my hands shake when I think about it. I'm writing this down because I need someone else to know, and maybe because I'm hoping someone can tell me I'm not crazy. The day started like any other autumn hike in Georgia's section of the trail. The morning air was crisp, leaves crunched under my boots, and that familiar earthy smell of decay filled my lungs. I'd planned a 3-day solo trek, something I'd done countless times before. The weather forecast was perfect, and I had all my gear dialed in. Everything felt normal until my second night out. I'd made camp near Blood Mountain. Yeah, I know the name doesn't help my story, but that's what it's called. The sun had set about an hour earlier, and I was getting ready to turn in when I noticed how quiet it had gotten. Not the peaceful kind of quiet you get in nature, but that wrong kind of quiet where even the crickets shut up. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a bear was nearby. Or a coyote. That happens sometimes, and the wildlife goes silent. But this silence felt different. Heavier. Like the air itself was holding its breath. That's when I caught the smell. Anyone who hikes knows the usual forest smells: wet leaves, moss, sometimes a skunk or a dead animal. This was different. It was like wet copper and rotting meat, but with this underlying sweetness that made my stomach turn. The smell got stronger, and with it came this sound. Not quite footsteps, more like something being dragged through the undergrowth. I clicked off my headlamp. Don't ask me why. It was pure instinct. In the darkness, I could make out something moving between the trees about 50 yards from my tent. The moon was bright enough that I could see it wasn't human-shaped, but it wasn't any animal I recognized either. It moved all wrong, like its joints were in the wrong places. For what felt like hours, I sat absolutely still in my tent, barely breathing. The thing moved around my campsite in wide circles, getting closer with each pass. The dragging sound would stop occasionally, and in those moments, I swear I could hear something like wet breathing. Around 3 a.m., according to my watch, it started to rain. Not hard, just a light drizzle. The sound of water hitting leaves must have covered my movement because I managed to grab my pack and slip out of the tent. I left everything else behind and walked as quietly as I could, trying to put distance between myself and whatever that thing was. I hiked through the night, moving as fast as I dared in the dark. When the sun finally came up, I was miles away from my campsite. I hitched a ride back to my car from the nearest road crossing and drove straight home. 2 days later, I went back with a couple of friends to get my tent and gear. Everything was exactly where I'd left it, but the ground around my campsite was torn up, like something had been digging. We found these weird marks on the trees too. Not claw marks, more like something had taken chunks out of the bark with dull teeth. I still hike, but never alone anymore, and never on that section of trail. I've tried researching similar encounters in the area, and while I found a few vague stories on obscure hiking forums, nothing matches exactly what I saw. The thing is, the Appalachian Trail is over 2,000 miles long, and most of it is pretty remote. Who knows what's out there in those woods, especially in the places where the trail goes quiet and the shadows grow deep. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I can still smell that sickly sweet copper scent. And I wonder if whatever it was is still out there, dragging itself through the undergrowth, waiting for the next solo hiker to make camp in its territory. What I saw in Shawnee State Forest. I used to work as a seasonal ranger in Shawnee State Forest, right where Ohio's portion of the Appalachians rolls through. Most people don't think of Ohio when they think mountains, but these hills hold secrets that still keep me up at night. What I encountered during my last week on the job in November 2024 changed everything I thought I knew about these woods. I was doing my final rounds before the end of my shift, checking the more remote camping areas as the sun was setting. The weather had turned nasty that week, unseasonably cold with a thick fog that seemed to cling to the valleys like smoke. My supervisor had mentioned some strange reports from hikers, unusual sounds at night, wildlife acting weird, and a few missing pets from the nearby communities. Nothing concrete, just the kind of stuff that makes you pay a little more attention to your surroundings. That evening, I noticed something odd about the forest floor near one of the lesser-used trails. The leaves and underbrush were pressed down in a wide path, like something heavy had been dragging itself through. Not unusual on its own. Sometimes fallen trees or flooding can create similar patterns. But this was different. The path zigzagged unnaturally, and there was this strange sheen on some of the crushed vegetation, almost like snail slime but darker. I followed the trail with my flashlight, telling myself I was just doing my job. The fog had gotten thicker, and the beam of light seemed to bounce back at me, making it hard to see more than 15 feet ahead. That's when I noticed the smell, like rotting mushrooms mixed with something metallic. Anyone who spends time in these forests knows their smells, but this was totally foreign. As I walked deeper into the woods, the temperature dropped dramatically. My breath came out in thick clouds, and the fog seemed to spiral around my legs. The crushed vegetation path led to a small clearing, and that's where I saw them. Trees with huge chunks missing from their trunks, not like bear marks or deer rubs, but almost like something had been eating the wood itself. The exposed areas were stained with that same dark, slimy substance, and my flashlight caught something moving in my peripheral vision. When I turned, the beam illuminated what looked like a massive dark mass shifting between the trees about 30 yards away. It was hard to make out its shape in the fog, but whatever it was, it moved like nothing I'd ever seen, flowing almost like liquid but maintaining a vaguely solid form. The closest thing I can compare it to is watching a massive octopus move underwater, except this was on land and much, much bigger. Every instinct told me to run, but I stayed frozen, watching as this thing moved through the forest. It seemed to absorb the fog around it, creating these weird void-like patches in the mist. As it moved closer, I could hear this sound, like wet leather being stretched and torn, mixed with a deep, subsonic rumble that I felt more than heard. What happened next still haunts me. The thing stopped moving and seemed to rise up, expanding vertically like a wave about to crash. In the beam of my flashlight, I saw what looked like dozens of eyes reflecting back at me, but they were all wrong, too large, irregularly spaced, and some of them blinked sideways. That's when my training finally kicked in, and I backed away slowly before turning and walking as calmly as I could toward my vehicle. I submitted my report the next day, carefully worded to focus on the damaged trees and unusual trail patterns. I included photos of the tree damage and the crushed vegetation, but left out most of what I'd seen. Who would believe me? The official report probably sits in some folder labeled vandalism or weather damage. I quit my job the following week. Told them I'd found a better opportunity elsewhere. The truth is, I couldn't go back into those woods. I've spent countless hours researching similar sightings in the Appalachians, and while there are scattered reports of strange encounters, nothing quite matches what I saw. But here's what keeps me up at night. The reports of weird sounds and missing pets in that area have increased since then. Every few weeks, I check the local news, half expecting to read about someone going missing in those woods. Sometimes, when it's foggy outside, I catch myself staring out the window, wondering if that thing is still out there, sliding through the ancient hills of Appalachia, leaving its strange marks on trees and waiting for someone else to stumble upon its feeding grounds. The forests of these mountains are vast, and we've barely scratched the surface of what lives in their deepest, darkest corners. The Whispering Hollows. I never wanted to tell this story. Some things in these mountains should stay buried, but after what happened to my cousin Beth last month, I feel like people need to know. Maybe it'll keep someone else from making the same mistake we did. I grew up in a tiny town in West Virginia, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and the oldest buildings have been standing since before the Civil War. My grandmother used to tell us stories about the hollow behind our property, how the early settlers would hear singing coming from deep in the woods, beautiful melodies that would draw people in. They'd follow the voices, and sometimes they'd never come back. We all thought they were just stories meant to keep us kids from wandering too far into the woods. That's what I believed until last summer, when Beth came to stay with us while her parents were going through their divorce. Beth was from the city, and she thought our local superstitions were hilarious. She'd mock the way we'd never go into certain parts of the woods after dark, or how we'd leave little offerings of cornbread and honey on our back porch during the dark moon. "It's the 21st century, she'd say, rolling her eyes point one night, after we'd been drinking my dad's moonshine. Sorry, Dad. Beth decided she wanted to prove once and for all that our family's stories were just backwoods nonsense. It was around midnight when she grabbed her phone to record what she called a debunking video. I tried to stop her, but you know how stubborn people get when they're trying to prove a point. The thing is, I followed her. I followed her right up to the edge of Whispering Hollow, where the old thorn bushes grow in shapes that look too much like faces. The air got thick there, like trying to breathe through cotton, and there was this smell. Not bad, exactly, but sweet in a way that made your teeth hurt. That's when we heard it. The singing, it wasn't like any voice I'd ever heard before. It sounded like multiple voices layered together, some high and clear as glass, others deep and rich as soil. The melody was familiar somehow, like a half-remembered lullaby, but the words weren't in any language I knew. Beth started walking toward it. I grabbed her arm, but she shook me off. "It's probably just some kids playing a prank," she said, but her voice was dreamy, distant. She took another step forward, and that's when I saw them. They looked like patches of shadow at first, moving between the trees. But shadows don't have eyes that shine like copper pennies. Shadows don't reach out with fingers that are too long and too many. I ran. God help me, but I ran. I could hear Beth behind me, and then I couldn't. When the search parties went out the next morning, all they found was her phone, the screen cracked but still recording. The video shows 3 hours of footage, but it's mostly just dark woods and strange sounds. Except for one frame, right at the end. Sometimes I watch it, even though it makes me sick. There's this face, pressed up against the lens. It looks almost human, except the mouth opens too wide, and keeps opening, and the eyes. The police said Beth probably got lost and fell into one of the old mining shafts. They said the video was corrupted, that what I saw was just digital artifacts. They filled out their reports and told us to keep hoping. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear singing from the hollow. And sometimes, one of the voices sounds just like Beth. I know what you're thinking. That this is just another creepy story, the kind that gets passed around on forums like this one. I wish it was. But here's the thing. If you live in Appalachia, if you know these mountains, you know there are places where the old magic never left. Places where the boundary between our world and something else gets tissue thin. So if you're ever in these hills, and you hear singing that makes your soul ache with longing, do what my grandmother always said. Plug your ears with beeswax, turn your jacket inside out, and run. Run as fast as you can toward civilization. And whatever you do, don't look back. Because in these mountains, some songs aren't meant for human ears, and some hollows are best left unwhispered. The Last Trail Marker. I've been a trail guide in the Appalachians for 12 years. I've seen bears, survived storms, and helped lost hikers find their way back to civilization. But what happened 3 weeks ago on the Black Rock Summit Trail? I still can't explain it. And I can't sleep anymore, not since I noticed the trail markers changing behind us. It started like any other guided hike. 6 people, mostly experienced hikers wanting to tackle some of the more remote paths. The weather report showed clear skies, and the late October air was crisp enough to keep the bugs away. Perfect hiking conditions. The first few hours were normal. We passed the usual white blazes marking the trail, our boots crunching through fallen leaves. But around mile 7, Beth, one of the hikers, asked me something that made my skin crawl. "Why are there 2 different colors of blazes here?" I stopped walking. There shouldn't have been. This section only had white markers. But when I looked back, I saw what she meant. Among the standard white blazes were older-looking marks in a deep, rust-brown color. They hadn't been there when we passed earlier. I told myself it was just some old paint showing through. Trail maintenance gets weird sometimes. But then I noticed how wet they looked. How they seemed to glisten in the afternoon light. We pressed on, but the brown blazes kept appearing. More frequently now. And they looked wrong. The edges were jagged, uneven, like they'd been clawed into the trees rather than painted. The color reminded me more and more of dried blood. Around sunset, we lost cell service. That wasn't unusual for this area, but the timing couldn't have been worse. Because that's when we heard it, a sound that still haunts me. Like someone dragging something heavy through the leaves, punctuated by a wet, rhythmic clicking. I gathered the group close, ready to set up camp early. That's when Jason, our point man, called out in confusion. "Guys, wasn't this tree behind us before?" He was pointing at a massive old oak, its trunk twisted like a helix. The kind of tree you remember. And he was right. We'd passed it 2 hours ago, heading in the opposite direction. The brown blazes surrounded us now. They were fresh, dripping. The clicking sound grew closer. I'm not proud of what happened next. We ran. All of us, no formation, no direction. Just blind panic through the darkening woods. People were screaming, branches whipping at our faces. I could hear that dragging sound keeping pace, always just behind us. One by one, the screams stopped. I found myself alone, legs burning, lungs on fire. The moon cast enough light to see the blazes on the trees had changed again. They were now crude, childlike stick figures. Dozens of them. All missing their heads. I ran until I hit a clearing I recognized, one near a ranger station. Somehow, I'd looped back to civilization. When search parties went out the next day, they found nothing. No bodies. No equipment. Just empty trails and normal white blazes. But I know what I saw. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night. I've been checking the trail maps obsessively since then. That section of trail? It's changing. Every new map shows it a little differently. The path is slowly twisting, forming a shape. From above, it's starting to look like one of those stick figures. I quit my job last week. But sometimes, when I look out my window at night, I see fresh brown blazes on the trees in my yard. They weren't there in the daylight. And the clicking, it's getting closer.